this idea of balance was something that honestly, no one in my family ever taught me. I learned along the way.
Hello and welcome to a new episode of the Peter O. Estevez Show. This is your host, Peter O. Estevez. I want to welcome today Dr. Armando Orduña to the show. Hello, Dr. Orduña. Welcome to the Peter O. Estevez Show.
Hello, Peter. Thank you for having me.
You know, I really enjoyed our pre-interview conversation yesterday, Dr. Orduña, and I want to dive in. So tell us a little bit about you, where you grew up, where you're from, and how did you decide to become an educator, which is a very noble career, one that I have a great appreciation for.
Okay, well, thank you. I appreciate the interest. It's actually, I think many of your listeners might be able to relate with this. I'm a born and raised Houstonian. We're here, Houston, Texas. My father immigrated from Mexico in 1959. My mother, on my mother's side, I'm sixth generation Tejano. Okay. So I had an opportunity growing up to see both sides of that world. Now, I know for a lot of people on the outside who maybe don't come from the immigrant community, they just may see that as, well, you're all Latino. It's true. My parents were both Latino. My parents were both of Mexican heritage. But after 5 generations of living on one side of the border, my mother's family and her cultural identity developed definitely one way. Whereas my father coming over from Mexico, his cultural identity was definitely developed another way. So for example, my father, he came over in 59, but he went back and forth a lot through the 60s and didn't really permanently stay here until the 70s. He pretty much missed a lot of the sexual revolution of which my mother grew up in. So there were certain things that my mother educated my father on, so to speak, about relationships and women's roles, men's roles in marriage. Anyway, I'm one of 6 brothers. So I grew up in a working class, blue collar family. My father laid tile. He was a tile setter, was in the construction business. And my mother was a homemaker. And occasionally she would leave the house to work small jobs whenever it was needed. But, for the most part, I grew up watching my father build a small business. It was a tile setting business. So think about the tiles in people's swimming pools or the tiles in people's homes, or you go into a restaurant and you see the tile on the floor there. That was pretty much what he spent his career doing. And I'm number 4 in that birthing order. So there were 3 older brothers, and he pretty much brought them in as a crew to work out the business. So by the time I was 11 years old, I knew what I wanted to do. I wanted to go work with my dad and my brothers in construction. I already saw it. We had a family business. We were building things. I enjoyed the idea as a little kid of tagging along with my older brothers and my dad and being helpful and learning from them and coming home at the end of a long day, tired and dirty and sweaty, taking a hot shower and then eating a meal with them and talking about the day. I felt like a grown man at age 11.
Wow.
Then the 80s hit, and we had a really bad oil bust here for those who were around in this area at the time who can remember that. So the economy just pretty much imploded across Houston and across the area. My father lost his business. My older brothers lost their jobs. They were already out of the house at that time, and some of them lost the homes that they were starting. And then I noticed how everything started to implode for my father and for my older brothers, for that matter. So his dream of coming to this country, starting his own business, it fell apart. And he came here with no high school diploma. My mother had a high school diploma, but that was pretty much it. And I watched my parents struggle. My father, he had a really hard time accepting this idea that everything that he had worked for was crumbling within a matter of months, to be quite honest. Wow. And soon after, within years, his marriage crumbled. And soon after that, his health crumbled. And soon after that, he died an early death. Wow. And I saw my older brothers going through a similar pattern of despair. They hadn't completed high school either, because the idea was there was always work around here. There's Houston was growing and never seemed to stop during the 70s and into the early 80s. So they never finished high school themselves. I was the first one in my family, aside from my mother, who actually was a dropout, but went back to finish her diploma. I was the first one in my family to not drop out of school, to go through high school. And then from there, I decided that I needed something more than just a hard work ethic. My dad had a hard work ethic. My older brothers had hard work ethics. There needed to be something more. So I was the first one to go to college. And I went through, and before I knew it, that's a whole other story, but I decided I wanted to work in education. I wanted to teach. And from there, I went into a master's and then ultimately into a doctorate, and then ultimately working in educational nonprofits for the benefit specifically of Latino families.
Wow, what an incredible story. And I do remember that bust of the 80s. In fact, I've been in the old business for many years, but primarily in the 80s, we were heavily vested in the real estate business. And I remember coming to Houston and looking at buildings and properties throughout Houston, and it was building after building after building vacant and in despair condition, just because the economy was so harsh. Interesting statistic based on some of what you said. You said your brothers and your father did not have a high school diploma. And, today we still have over 33% of the Latino population in the US that does not have a high school diploma. Okay. And I can quote a couple of other statistics that I think are very important, is the fact that there over 30% of those Latinos only speak Spanish, and over 50% don't have a driver's license in most states. In my opinion, Dr. Orduña, these are barriers to prevent Latinos from breaking the cycle of poverty, dysfunction, and illiteracy. What is your opinion and your take on that?
No, I do agree. My father, when he came over to this country, one of the first things he did was enroll himself in English classes. These were night classes. So he understood, and I often asked him, because over the years, he never once applied for citizenship. He had his residency, he had his paperwork in order, but when the opportunity would come to apply for citizenship, he always held back. It was something that more of a point of cultural pride, I guess, for him, that he was still a citizen of his home country. But when it came to, when I would ask him, but you've gone so far, you've learned English, you've learned many of the customs and the culture here. He explained, well, yes, of course. I made the choice to travel to another country. Why wouldn't I learn the language of the country? I wanted to flourish here. I wanted to build a business here. I wanted to start a family here. So yes, I would learn the language of the country, and I would learn the customs, and I would learn the culture. But I would also maintain much of my own identity. But he went through all of the rigors that you're talking about: driver's license, taxes, paperwork, and making sure that his business was started correctly. All of those things that he did because he understood that he wanted not just to move from one town to another, from one country to another, but he wanted to thrive along the way. And he wanted his family to thrive along the way. And he understood for that to happen, there were certain barriers that he had to overcome. One was the language. The second was understanding how business was done in this country. On and on it went. But you're absolutely right. There are too many of us out in the community, Latinos in the community, who think, well, my family's gotten along this way so far, so long, we can just continue to do it this way. And we can continue to do this, and we can continue to survive. Well, yeah, maybe you could continue to survive. Nobody has a driver's license. Maybe you could continue to survive. Nobody has a high school diploma. But at what point is surviving not enough? At what point do you want to thrive? At what point do you want your family to flourish? At what point do you want to be able to look back and see that your family has progressed generation after generation after generation? We can talk about building generational wealth later, but I'm just talking about all of the other things, all of the other components that make life worth living important, like the idea of going to school and learning about things that you really care about, and learning that life is more than just feeding your body. It's more than just putting a roof over your head, and it's more than just driving a car.
Absolutely. And you talked about something that I think is needed to discuss more. I think there is this particular belief system in the Latin community that surviving, if you're just surviving, it's okay. If you put, I mean, we use words like we put a roof over our head, okay? We're providing the groceries in the refrigerator. It's almost like it's never more about, it's never beyond surviving. It's never beyond surviving. It's never about thriving, period. In fact, I think that word has recently kind of popped up in our radar, right? We have never heard of it much. I don't remember hearing that in my home. But I want to talk about something that you said also. What is the power of being able to, of affirmations when you say, it's okay if we survive, it's okay if we kind of go along this way, it's okay, we work hard, we're going to be able to pay our bills, take the rent, take care of the car, take care of the basic necessities. What is the power of that belief system? Okay, how are we affirming to stay in that negative rooted mindset by continuing to use some of those words? What's your opinion on that?
So I want to make sure that I'm understanding. We're talking about the language that keeps us, basically keeps us down where we're at, or keeps us static, keeps us in a static phase of life.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, that, you know, and that's a really good point, because unfortunately, I think there are too many stories in our community where unintentionally our families use that language to basically limit us. They, you know, when I wanted to go to college, I went to an out-of-state college. My mother didn't understand why I wanted to go out of state. I wanted to go out of state because I was getting a big scholarship to go out of state, and there was opportunity out of state. But the way she saw it was, you're going to leave the family. And when you leave the family, that means that it's on some level, there's some kind of rejection of the family, that you're choosing self over family. And that's one of the cultural values that we generally share, right? Family comes first. I still hold to that value. And I think so many of my peers that I work with in education also hold to that value, but we have maybe a longer view of what that means, being there for the family.
Absolutely.
So in the case of my older brothers, they chose to drop out of high school, start working immediately. The homes that they chose were in the same neighborhood. They were never too far away from my mother and father. They were there constantly, day in, day out, either because of work or coming over on the weekends. We were a family, and that's how it was seen, as the richness of family. Whereas my path was a longer range path, finding the resources that I would be able to build a more secure life, in which I would be a better support for my family for years to come, long after hopefully to survive recessions that come along, or to also inform my family about really important things that I learned along the way. And these were things that I think now we can agree on are important, but 20 years ago, 30 years ago, at least in the community that I was growing up in, were seen as kind of strange. So I would come back and I would explain to my family, my mother, like, I think we could be eating better. And when I mean eating better, I mean, like, have you tried using these types of vegetables? Have you tried using this, changing our diet this way? And it was different, and that was strange, and she didn't really know what to make of that. But I explained how the food that we ate led to the health conditions that we would have later in life, or even presently. Those were things I learned when I was away in college, because I would take classes and I would come back. We didn't have those discussions growing up as a kid.
Let me not minimize that point that you just finished making. How did you deal with the fact that subconscious guilt that your mom put upon you when you were going away to college? How did you deal with it, and how was it that you not fall that into what we call the comfort zone, right? And not because it's comfortable, but because it's known. How is it that you were able to break that barrier and get your mother to understand that it was more important to create a long-term legacy of literacy and sustainability and progress for the family by you going away? How did you deal with that?
So the best way that I dealt with that was in introducing my mother to many of the parents of my friends who were going through the exact same situation. Now, I can tell you that at the time that I was in high school, and in the high school I went to, I was bused to a school in the city through a magnet program. I had the opportunity to meet children coming from all types of families, white, Black, Asian, Middle Eastern, etc. And my mother had an opportunity during those 4 years to get to know not only my friends, but also their parents, and to come to value their opinions. Because for the first time ever, I was going to school, or somebody in my family was going to school with the children of professionals, the children of lawyers and doctors. And these were the aspirational goals that my mother had. She just didn't know, these were the aspirational goals my mother had for her children. She just didn't know how to help us get there. And so when opportunities came, scholarships and grants, and they were going to take us away, that's when honestly I would lean on the parents of my friends to come join me to talk to my mother and to help her understand that this wasn't a bad thing, and that it didn't mean that I was leaving forever and I was out of her life. It just meant that I was going to get a chance to do things that nobody in our family had ever gotten a chance to do. And it wasn't until later in life, honestly, because ultimately I became an educator, which, as many of your listeners may understand, although it may be a highly respected career, it's not necessarily the most lucrative. I didn't go into oil and gas, or I didn't go into banking. I went into education. But the thing is, I learned a career. I learned the skill sets to have a career, to take care of my economic needs. But along the way, I also learned the skill sets to apply to other areas in my life to lead a more balanced life. So I learned about nutrition because I was exposed for the first time outside of when I went away to my freshman year of college. I was exposed to foods that I had never seen before. Right. I was exposed to nutritional values that I never knew about. Then I was later exposed to exercising that I'd always been, I liked sports growing up, but never thought about why is it important to exercise? Not just about taking that ball across the goal line, but why is it important to exercise for me, for my mental health, for my physical health, my emotional health? I later learned about emotional health. All of those things came to me later so that I could lead the life I wanted. I mean, honestly, what would it matter to me if I did choose another route and I was making, for example, a lot more money, but I was depressed, emotionally unhealthy? Would it matter to me if I was physically healthy, but I couldn't make my rent because I didn't have the skill sets to pay the bills? This idea of balance was something that, honestly, no one in my family ever taught me. I learned along the way. And when I come back, meaning in the sense that I now teach these values to my children, and I teach these values to my nieces and nephews, so that our family can grow up understanding that high-paying job is not the only reward out there. That's not the only carrot for a well-rounded education.
Wow. You left me speechless there for a second, Dr. Orduña. Let me talk a little bit about who you are and where you come from, because you are very humble with your background. You're a 23-year career educator. You have a doctorate in education. Your background has been anchored in the intersection of STEAM access and immigrant-origin youth families on the role of practical STEM learning plays of foreign language acquisition. You previously served as the Director of Outreach Programs for Children's Museum of Houston, where you led the department educators in the export of multilingual family and out-of-school learning through Greater Houston. Prior to this, you served as a secondary science teacher in urban Title I public schools. Your A-list professional appointments includes inaugural Houston Board of Fellow with Latinos for Education, Board to Connect Community, Purpose to Build Communities, a Houston nonprofit focused on serving unique needs of immigrant and refugee families, Board President of the Emmy Sounds Foundation of Texas, a nonprofit providing material support and spinal cord injury survivors. Inaugural of the Teacher Advisory Council for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, curriculum writer for Twin Cities Public Television, on-board member of the East Education Project, and in 2012, you received a Commitment of Excellence Award from the President's Advisory Commission on Education and Excellence for Hispanics. Wow, what an incredible resume. And thank you for your humility. And I wanted to bring that up because you're so humble and you downplay your accomplishments and your achievements. But I want to go back into the story you were sharing. At the crossroads you found yourself as a young man, being introduced to a completely different culture, you know, going from tortillas to a healthy, balanced diet, going from, you know, kicking the ball around the house to actually learning an exercise regime and the importance of nutrition, the importance of exercise, the importance of mental health, the importance of physical health, the importance of spiritual well-being, the importance of financial literacy, all the important things that are not part of our DNA, that are not part and continue to be not part of the Latino community. But you had your mom that wanted all these good things for you, but she did not know how to get you there. And you were there by being able to get into a pilot school. Help me with the word because that's not the correct word. Magna High School that gave you the entry gateway into a successful career and an entry gateway into actually going to college. But how do parents, because you and I know, we had this conversation before, you and I know that there's so many parents like your mother out there that want the best for their children, but they don't know how to start. They don't know what to do. What is it that is the first step for a mother like yours that finds herself today figuring out what little Pedro or little Armando or little John or little Juanito wants to go to college or wants a better education, but they don't even know where to start?
Well, that's a really good question. One correction I will say is currently I am the executive director for Latinos for Education for the Texas office.
Yes, absolutely. My apologies.
I need to update that bio.
Yeah, my apologies.
No problem. No problem. So then to answer that question, I really reflect back on what worked for me, right? In the sense that I couldn't convince my mother about all of the options that were out there by myself because I didn't know. I was a teenage kid and I didn't know what was out there. I just knew that there was an out there somewhere and I wanted to explore it. So what did I do? I looked for people who did know. I looked for those professionals, those parents of my friends, those lawyers and doctors and stockbrokers who had walked that path before. And we arranged dinners. We went over to each other's homes. They stayed after school at the parent meetings. I made sure that there was introductions. I had phone calls. It was a long process because I knew very early on that I wanted something beyond high school. And I knew my mother wanted that for me too. She just didn't know how far to let me go, I guess, is in her mind. And so when I would recommend for families, and I guess it boils down to education because that's what I was doing. I was educating my mother. I didn't know these things. So I found the people who did know these things and to have them, we held conversations. They had conversations parent to parent. We had conversations family to family. Then later on, I would follow up with those conversations with my mother. And we would have conversations mother to son. We would have all of these talks going round and round about what it would mean, what it would cost, and not just cost in the sense of dollars, but what would it cost in the sense of time and the emotional cost of not being there. There was a lot to it. I would recommend to anybody who's facing the similar situation. I mean, now we have internet, and so there's a lot more access. If they don't have access to the people around them, like I did, the parents of the friends that I had, well, now there are, for example, shows like this that they can sit down with their parents and say, listen, here are two Latinos who grew up in a working class neighborhood, working class families, and they're talking about their paths to success. Listen to what they did. Let's hear other talk shows, or let's go into do more exploration and research on the internet, and let's find out all these different programs that are out there that could help me to move forward on things that I want to do. Now, whether it's university or not, that's a whole other story as well, because I'm a strong believer that although college may not be for everyone, post-secondary education is for everyone. There's no just leaving high school and going on and having a successful life. You leave high school and you either go on and pursue a college degree, or you pursue a technical trade, you get certified in something. You have to be prepared to enter the workforce. And a K through 12 education does not prepare anyone to enter the workforce, other than a minimum wage job. So there's a lot of different avenues now, resources. Again, internets, the schools and their counselors, and there's tons of nonprofits in any large, medium to large size city that is working with families and particularly high school students in opening the doorways for college access.
I love that. And you're right. You know, I'm a firm believer that not everybody needs to go to college, but everyone needs an education. And the importance of post-education after high school, after whatever, whether it's trade, whether it's online courses, whether it's developing your personal skills, whatever they may be. However, Dr. Orduña, there's a big myth out there, and you and I talked about it on the post interview a little bit. There's a big myth today when people hear stories like a Mark Zuckerberg or an Elon Musk or XYZ successful individual that dropped out of college and went on to build, in the case of Elon Musk, went on to build, becoming the richest man in the world, or Mark Zuckerberg, one of the youngest billionaire of his generation. And I can toot around many, many, many names, but I have not heard Juan Martinez or John Rodriguez or Octavio Esteves or Dr. Orduña, for that matter, right? We have not heard the name. Why do you believe that that's the reason we have not heard that kind of wealth coming out of Latinos like yourself and herself?
Well, I think it can be boiled down to social capital. So they may have, these people that you're talking about may have dropped out of college, but through their family's network, through their family alone. I have no idea what the Zuckerberg family's entire wealth was before he dropped out of college, or for that matter, Elon Musk's family. But I mean, these were well-to-do families to begin with. They weren't clinging to the bottom rung of the middle class or trying to emerge out of poverty. These people also had large, extensive social networks in which they could connect their children to for investors. So I can say I'm sure, I don't know the personal stories of any of these people, but I know for a fact, in the case of Bill Gates, for example, he became one of the leading people around software at a time when not many people knew about that kind of work in programming. Well, how did he do that? Well, because he grew up in a neighborhood that was biking distance from the University of Seattle. And from there, they had one of the first mainframe computers. His family knew somebody who worked at the university, and he was able to go in and have time playing, and I'm using air quotes, playing around with that computer, learning about it. He would go in after school on his own time and just understand how the computers functioned. And he did that for years. And by the time that he went away to school, to university, he already had a firm understanding about IT and where it would go and where it could go. Well, so let's start there. The fact that his family was able to afford a house near a university, and they had connections to that university, and he was able to access those computers. That is social capital. That is leveraging one's network or family's network. So for people who grew up in a blue collar family situation, I could have gone and maybe learned the mechanics trade from the neighbor across the street.
The same thing is happening, just in a different.
Precisely, the same thing is happening. I could have gone and learned how to become a plumber from the friend at the end of the corner that my father had. These were the options that were open to me and my family's social network. I could have learned how to become a different type of tradesman, but that was pretty much it.
Yeah, absolutely. The social capital, the disparity between social capitals is completely different. I call it, in the case of the Zuckerbergs, in the case of the Elon Musk, I call it educational pedigree, right? Which I really believe that there's an important for us, that we are one generation away from breaking the cycle of dysfunction, illiteracy, and poverty. But we need to have what you said a few minutes ago. We need to be able to get the family in the same wavelength. We need to get the family to be able to say, hey, mom, have you heard Dr. Orduña and Peter Esteves talking about these issues? How did they come up? How did they overcome these challenges? How did they overcome these adversities? And that is exactly what our movement Excelente is doing. That is exactly one of the reasons that you and I connected when early on we reached out to you to be a speaker for Latin Talks. And what is Latin Talks? Latin Talks is a series of talks and conversations where your local Latin leaders, like Dr. Orduña, is going to be able to share with you, as he is doing today, how he overcame the challenges and adversities that he was faced as a young boy. As a young boy, he was at a crossroads where he could have continued to become a tile installer, a tile man, okay, like his father was, like his brothers were, his brothers that didn't go to high school, or he decided at that point where he was aware enough to realize that that was not the gateway to success. That was not going to get the family out of poverty. That was not going to get the family to continue to try to educate and to build a new generational cycle of healthy, educated, literate, established, well-spoken human beings. With that in mind, there's still a lot of issues beyond education that permeate in our community. And among them is abuse, sexual, physical, mental, emotional, okay? Machismo, okay? How do we deal with those, Dr. Orduña? What do we need to do in order to break those cycles? Because I think there's two facets that we need to deal with, right? The education and also the cultural assimilations or the cultural belief systems that we had carried on from generation to generation.
Those are very good questions. I think, it's funny because growing up, I told you that my father was from Mexico. My mother grew up here in Texas. For her family been here for generations. So they had, in some ways, some shared belief systems, and in other ways, very different views on how to raise children. We obviously, most communities, they want to preserve there's a lot of cultural pride in preserving the cultural values that we hold dear, that make us who we are. So, for some people that means language, for other people that means the certain recipes, cooking in the kitchen, and for other people it means the songs that they sing to their children. It can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. In regards to abuse, and I think I'm glad you called it that, because we need to name things what they are. So, for example, rearing children, disciplining children. I grew up in a household that was not shy about spanking. I grew up in a household that was not shy about, quote unquote, using the belt to correct the boys. We were all boys, so there was this idea that boys, they can take it. They did wrong, they can take, here in Texas, we would call it a whooping with the belt. It wasn't till, and I grew up thinking that was normal because that's what my friends next door were getting when they got into trouble. That's what everywhere in the neighborhood, that's what I saw. That was the type of discipline I saw. And it wasn't until I grew up, married, and had my own children, and I married a teacher, an early childhood educator. I was a science teacher, a STEM teacher by training, and I taught older kids. My wife is an early childhood educator. And I remember when we had our first child, I had no problem with spanking. I wasn't going to take the belt to her. She's a little girl, and I couldn't imagine myself doing that. But my wife took me aside and said, and my wife is Latina, but she had gone through years of early childhood education and training to say, listen, there are other ways to educate and discipline our daughter other than hitting her. Because when you hit her, all she understands is whoever's bigger and stronger and hits hardest, they're the one who is right, regardless of what the issue is. And she will grow up living life thinking that whoever can hit harder is right. And that's not what we want to teach her. And she was absolutely right. So we call it discipline in the culture, but in reality, it's physical abuse. And I've learned since then that I don't have to hit my children to get them to listen to me. There are other approaches for me to communicate with my children. And that's something that is a cultural value that I think we can lose. I think that's something that we can change over time. I know there are a lot of people out there who still feel like, well, I went through that and it didn't hurt me. Like, well, let's talk about it. Because I think if you start to unpack some of that generational trauma, I think maybe that you'll find that it really did hurt you in certain ways in how you conduct your relationships and how you conduct your communication with your own children. And if they are as open with you as you would like them to be, or if they're more fearful of you than you probably realize. In regards to machismo, oh, I'm sorry, go on.
No, please go ahead.
Well, in regards to machismo, my wife and I are both Tejanos. We were born and raised here in Texas. She had a very similar story. One of her parents was born here in Texas for generations. Her other parent emigrated here from Mexico. So both of us are very interested in preserving many cultural values, things that we feel very proud of as Latinos, Tejanos. But there are certain things about the culture that we can look at and we can say, no, we're not going to transmit that cultural component to our children because we don't see any value in it. So, for example, the physical abuse, but calling it discipline. The other one would be machismo. I have 2 daughters and I love my daughters very, very much. And I teach my daughters that in no world, either here in this country or in other countries, in no context should they ever feel less when compared to a man. In no world should they ever feel like they have to be quiet because a man is speaking louder. In no world should they ever feel like they have to listen and follow simply because the instructions are coming from a man's voice. I want them to be strong, independent, resourceful, and emotionally, physically healthy women. And the machismo stuff, they can just look at that and it can be as foreign to them as something from Mars. It has nothing to do, it has no positive component to add to the culture. Now, I'm not talking about masculinity. I think that's completely different.
Right.
I grew up with 5 brothers and a father, and they were all strong men. And when I look at masculinity and its positive terms, these were family men. I look at a man who wakes up in the morning before the sun rises, heads out to work, works all day, comes back and supports his family. That to me is one of the strongest features of masculinity. And that's something I try to emulate for my own children. But I saw that with my father, I saw that with my tios, and I saw that, now I'm gonna be honest, not with all my brothers, but I saw that with some of my brothers as well. That idea of the commitment to the family and making sure that as everything that you could do would somehow come back and benefit the family. Even when I went away to college, even when I went away and did one degree after another degree, I was pulled away from my family, but I had a long game plan. I knew that with every new degree that I was accumulating and gaining, at least in my field of education, I knew that would make me more marketable. And I knew that I would be able to provide better supports from my family later in life. Yes, there was definitely a long wait game. There was also a lot of family events that I missed along the way that the family didn't understand. I couldn't make it to every baptism. I couldn't make it to every birthday party. I couldn't make it to all the little events that make us so happy when we see each other. But when I was finished with graduate school, when I was finished with all of that, I came around, and this time I was able to come around and share things that I was really proud of and things that I knew would make their lives better, and share those ideas. Like, for example, talking to my other brothers, like, hey, listen, I see you hitting your kid over there. Let's come over here and talk, or spanking, excuse me. I see you spanking your kid. Okay, thank you for correcting me. But let me talk to you about another way that you can talk to your son that he'll still hear you and still respect you afterwards, etc.
How were those conversations welcome, Dr. Orduña? How were they welcome when early on you're the one that left the family, goes off, and then comes back? And if I use typical Latino terms, you have become the know-it-all, right? You're that's a negative connotation, and it was intended from my perspective for it to be a negative connotation. So sure. How were those conversations welcome? How was it at some point that you were able to break the ice? Because that's exactly what we're trying to do through Latin Talks. You said something a minute ago. Hold on to your thought for a second. When you were referring to abuse and you talked about, well, I grew up that way and nothing happened to me. Look the way I turn out. Well, we can look at many situations and say, well, how's that working out for you? But that's exactly part of the problem in our community, is that we don't talk about it. Okay, that there has been many demons that have become secrets in families for multi-generations, from the lack of literacy, from the lack of understanding, from the lack of communication, from the physical to the sexual to emotional abuse. All of those things have been kept silent for many, many generations. So when somebody comes in and we learn that we've been doing things wrong, that's the reality. How do we immerse ourselves into a conversation with a family member where we don't rock the boat, where we don't become offensive, when we become the outsider, when it's not a negative influence, but we are able to transmit a message of positivity to the family unit, so it takes a domino effect and becomes part of the change?
So I think that question has two answers. The first one is leading by example. So I can't have a conversation about improving the nutrition in the house unless I am following good nutrition examples myself.
Right.
So I can't walk to you with a bag of potato chips and every day, 3 times a day, and tell you to put your bag of potato chips down if that's what I'm doing. So leading by example is one. And then the other answer to that question is coming from a place of humility and care, not coming from, let me tell you what you're doing wrong, but rather, let me share this moment I had when my thinking changed. I was doing some of these things too, without really thinking about why I was doing them. It's just because that's what I saw growing up. And so let me tell you about this time that I learned that it could be done differently. And differently, it's better, at least it's better for me. You may think it's better too. Let's talk about it. Let's have a conversation. Bringing the person in and engaging them as a peer and talking to them and allowing them to really explain the reason why they do the things they do. So for example, let's go back to the child discipline. If they can explain to you, well, I hit my kid because X, Y, and Z. I'm like, okay, did they stop doing it? Well, no, I mean, he did the same thing a week later. Like, so then hitting him the first time, it didn't work.
Not working, yeah.
It's, if you're hitting your kids all the time or once a week or whatever it might be, because they're not listening to you, then hitting your kid, spanking or whatever you want to call it, it's not working. Let's try something else. I mean, you got to admit, if your car's not working and you know that you checked this part and that part, well, you're going to start looking for other reasons why it might not be working. You're not going to keep going back to the same parts over and over. Well, I think it's the transmission. Well, we already looked at the transmission. The transmission is working fine. It must be something else. You have to make sure that the people are open to explaining first, why do you hit? Why is that your first and last reaction? And then if they can start unpacking it, and it usually breaks down to, well, that's how I was raised. You're like, well, there are things about how you were raised that you know that you don't want to do, right? Yes. All right, well, then maybe this is one of those things. Let's just start exploring what other things that you could do to get through to communicate to your child to improve their behavior along the way. And I think once you allow people that opportunity to unpack their thinking, to really dig deep inside themselves of asking, why do I do the things I do? Because not many of us actually reach that point. Many of us will reach it later in life if we're lucky, but I've seen, unfortunately, many people go through their entire lives, right all the way up into the grave, where they never stopped and asked themselves, why do I do these things?
Sure.
Why do I do this thing or that thing that I know ruins my physical health, that I know damages my relationships, that I know stops me short of the career goals I want? Why do I keep doing these things? Because they never stop long enough to ask those questions. And oftentimes they need somebody to come in and have that conversation with them. I guess on some level, that's education as well. And that's the kind of work that I've been doing for many years now, that I do formally and then informally with family and friends.
Well, absolutely, because I think that emotional education or emotional intelligence is parallel to an educational right? It's just as important as math and science and everything else, right? Let me ask you a question. My family migrated to the United States when I was 10 years old, and it was a very difficult era for the Hispanic community across the board, whether you were Texan, Hispanic, Chicano, whatever you want to label yourself. I remember Spanish not being spoken in the classroom. You would literally get paddled. That was what the school system used to call it. You would literally get paddled if you spoke Spanish. So there was a moment in time that I renounced where I came from. There was a certain shame and lack of pride. And, that's where, Pedro turned into Peter, right? That's where I pursued to learn things that I didn't know and I didn't understand. That's where I really dove into assimilation of the culture to make sure that I try to fade away the accent as much as I could. Not that I've done a very good job, but I try to fade it as much as I could. So there was all the assimilation that came in for me. But I would also remember experiencing something that for the Tejanos, for the Chicanos, for the Mexican Americans in the country, they went through a very difficult time that is very seldom talked about. There was a different kind of discrimination that they experienced that we never talk about that. At least I haven't seen a format where this is discussed. They don't speak Spanish, that there was a lack of pride of being Latino, of your heritage, that, there was a time where their ancestors were called wetbacks. So you didn't want any association with that. I remember we lived at the corner of Hillcrest and Bangor in San Antonio, Texas, and our house was often graffiti with the words mojado or wetback, go home. So I could see where I would see other Latinos, other Hispanos or Chicanos or Americans in the classrooms, but they didn't speak to me in Spanish. And I would often wonder as a young kid, well, you look like me, you're brown like me, your hair is the same color as mine. Well, that was when I had hair, Dr. Orduña. And but yet you don't speak Spanish. What impact do you think that had in the assimilation of the immigrant into the American culture?
It's what you're talking about is cultural trauma. That type of cultural trauma does get transmitted generationally. This is why we have, for example, many Latinos who, at some point, so many Latinos who don't speak Spanish, right? I know a lot of Latinos working in education and in the professional field that can tell me, oh, I wish I knew Spanish, but in my house, we only spoke English because my parents were told by educators, if you want a successful life for your children in this country, only speak to them in English. Yeah. Don't confuse them with two languages. And that was something that happened a generation ago, 2 generations ago. So that kind of cultural trauma then transmits later to their children. And then those non-Spanish speaking Latinos, maybe they don't feel as close to the culture when they see other Latinos. They don't necessarily listen to the same music because they don't understand it, or they don't necessarily order the same foods at the restaurants because this is, well, actually, no, that's another thing. Here's a little cultural axiom for you. It's among the immigrant community, it's often repeated that the first thing to go is the language, the last thing to go is the food. That's something that usually hangs on for generations. Yeah. I want to correct myself. But my point is this: what you're talking about is very true. Growing up, I had 2 sides of the family. My father's family from Mexico, and he was the only one at that time had come over to the United States. And then I had my mother's side of the family who had been here in Texas, like I said, 6 generations. And there was a sense of intracultural divide, right? So I remember growing up as a kid, spending time with my extended family from my mother's side, and I would hear Tejanos speaking in derogatory terms about Mexicanos. Right. I was so confused because here were people that they looked alike, they had similar, they ate the same foods, they listened, and oftentimes they would listen to the same music, but they would draw a distinction. Well, I don't speak Spanish, I speak English. I'm an American citizen. They're, like you said, mojados, wetbacks. And I was confused because I was raised to have cultural pride in where my family came from and where we were and how to contribute and transmit that cultural pride in the communities that I lived in. So it always confused me growing up as a kid to hear Tejanos or Chicanos bad-mouthing Mexicanos, but then I would go to, visit in Mexico, and I would hear the same thing.
Yeah, pocho. Pocho. Yeah.
Exactly. I would hear the same thing in reverse. I would hear Mexicanos degrading Chicanos and using words like pocho. And that confused me as well. I was like, well, wait a minute, you just don't understand. These people, the ones that you're calling pochos, they were beaten in school. They were slapped in school for speaking Spanish, or they couldn't get jobs if they didn't learn how to assimilate to a certain degree from the white dominant cultural companies that were hiring. So you can't fault them for learning how to acquire those customs that they needed, those cultural customs that they needed so that they could gain employment, for example. Anyway, a lot of those conversations fell on deaf ears on both sides. But you're right, there is that intercultural conflict. And I don't think we talk about it enough. I don't think we talk about it enough that we really need to heal with our community, because we're not a monolith, of course, but we shouldn't be so divided over things like language. I have family members who don't speak a word of English on one side, and I have family members who don't speak a word of Spanish on the other side. And there are times when we do come together for big holidays, we somehow make it work. Over time, we've gotten to learn how to get along. If we could have that same type of accepting energy go out and radiate through the community, I think it would be much better for our children growing up. And I'm really thankful that we now see more and more Latino representation in our media, because it's so much easier as a parent for me to point to things like popular films with children, popular music that the kids can listen to and take cultural pride from. So, for example, when my kids sit in front of a Disney movie and there are Latino characters and they're speaking in Spanish, that tells them, you're okay. You're a good thing right here. This is you. This is a representation of you. This is a kid that has your type of hair, that has your type of skin, that speaks the words that you understand. And then vice versa. It also tells those Latino kids who are growing up not as immersed in the culture as some of the other ones that say, oh, it is okay. It is okay for me to learn a few Spanish words, just like so-and-so. So that they're understanding that they can take on those, as much of the cultural pride that they want. Because sometimes it works into a way where, and this is what I really dislike, is when somebody is trying to learn and someone else is shaming them for not knowing enough. Oh, you know a little Spanish, but you're not completely fluent. Well, the person's learning. Why would you wouldn't walk up to a third grade child and say, well, you know third grade math, but you don't know fourth grade math. Well, he's learning, and you want to encourage that person as they learn. Oh, you know a little bit about some of the cultural clothing to wear, but you don't know about all of this other regions from other parts of this country. No, but they're learning. Let's support what they're doing. Learning is a lifelong journey. And unfortunately, I think what we do is oftentimes we take time to degrade and pull down somebody else because we're feeling bad about something ourselves. And that's an easy way to approach somebody. Well, I don't have the same economic opportunity as those Chicanos, so I'm going to start pulling them down on cultural pride.
Absolutely. And that's a good segue to beginning to wrap up our conversation, Dr. Orduña. You said something about we beginning to see actors and actresses of mainstream spaces, particularly in the movie films where we see our children can simulate. But there's still a lack of leaders that are mainstream. There's still a lack of people in spaces where we can look for role models. You know, I remember growing up, and if I looked at my immediate surroundings, and this is not being disrespectful or ungrateful for what my parents were able to give to me, but there was nothing that I wanted to assimilate. There was nothing that I wanted to look like. I didn't want to inspire to be like my neighbor or the guy at the grocery store in the corner. And that's not minimizing anyone at all. It's just that I knew within me that there was other potential that I did not, that it was undiscovered, undeveloped, because I was uninspired by my current circumstances. And I knew that if I was able to find other people that looked like me, that spoke like me, that sounded like me, that came from where I came from, but have achieved a level of success beyond what I was used to, I could then tap into my potential. And that is exactly why we started this movement, Excelente. That is exactly why we started the platform for Latin Talks, where we have leaders like yourself that come into the program to talk to the young men and women and the families that have still not assimilated to the culture because of fear, because of insecurity, because I'm not enough, because of the imposter syndrome. So this is just the beginning of breaking through all those issues in order to create a better and greater future generation. Dr. Orduña, thank you so much. See, my accent still comes in very heavy at times. Thank you, when I get excited. Thank you so much for your time and your incredible wisdom and giving us the opportunity to share your knowledge and experiences with our community.
You're quite welcome, Peter. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much.